Welcome to Influencers. Everyone we speak to will be making a difference in some aspect of cycling or micromobility. Some will be unsung heroes and others people you might already know. Melbourne-based Charlie Farren has spent a lifetime riding bikes and also encouraging many others to ride. She's the founder of iconic mass participation cycling events, including Around the Bay in a Day and the Great Victorian Bike Ride. Charlie has also volunteered her considerable organisational skills as a director of both the Amy Gillett Foundation and Cycling Australia, now AusCycling. As president of what was then Bicycle Victoria, she played a key role, assisted by her late husband Paul and others, in transforming what was once a tiny, cash-strapped organisation into one of the largest cycling organisations in the world, and was awarded life membership for her services. Supporting Paul, Charlie co-created and now oversees the Farren Collection, one of the world's best collections of vintage bicycles. She has brought optimism, enthusiasm, and a wonderful dose of British eccentricity to all of these many and varied roles. I'm sure you'll be entertained and encouraged by Charlie Farren. Well, Charlie, thanks very much for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, at least I think it will be.
Now, not too many ladies go by the name Charlie. So was that something given to you by your parents or something you decided?
Goodness, no. My mother never ever used that nickname, but I picked it up in Britain where I grew up, and there's a saying to be a right Charlie, to play the fool, and I think that's the category I came into. And when I joined a cycling club in my early teens, I was the only female. I don't think the blokes like that very much, so I got a male name, and it stuck with me all these years.
Now, please tell me the name of that club, because it has a wonderful name.
Oh, the Mitcham and Tooting Cycling Club. I lived in South London, and it was a touring club. No. So I've never really raced, but I've done time trials and puffed up hills behind guys in leather shorts, and at the time they were smoking pipes too. But
So, as your accent gives away already, but you've now readily admitted you don't come from these parts.
Hey, look, I've been here longer than I've lived in the UK. So decades, you know, I came back in the Middle Ages really to Australia, and I think it's a wonderful place as long as you can escape from time to time. So the last year of not being able to escape and see the rest of the world has been a bit constraining.
So your first trip from England to Australia, you chose a rather unusual form of transport.
Oh, it was the wonderful Morris Minor 4-door deluxe, I'll have you know, that failed the MOT, the inspection in Britain. I bought it from Uncle Eddie for 10 quid, and the back had rusted out. You know, you could put your feet through the floor at the back. But we chose this, my late husband, gorgeous Paul Farren. We were going to do the Grand Overland trip and then go back to London to live and resume our lives. And we were going to do this in the Morris Minor. So we set off with a box on the roof with all the tools and the stuff in, and we took the back seats out so we could sleep in the Morris Minor. And we had a stunning budget for the year of £500. That was it. So you could call this a budget trip. And we had some adventures. A lot of adventures.
I bet you did. And how far did the Morris actually get? Where was it left behind?
I don't know that we left it behind, but we sold it in Nepal. It got all the way through to Nepal, having had quite a few adventures on the way. We got arrested in a couple of places, and in Pakistan we got into Rawalpindi, and this little car almost smiled, because having been a lone voyager for all those months, all the taxis in Rawalpindi were Morris Minors. And suddenly it was amongst all of these friends chuffing around. But we got to Nepal, and we knew that by that stage we were going to go further and fly to a couple of places. And so we sold this decrepit little Morris Minor to somebody that was heading back to the UK. So for all I know, it's still shuttling backwards and forwards to the UK.
So this magnificent backdrop, we should talk about this before we go much further, because anyone watching this would think, what on earth is this all about? So would you like to just explain?
It's a magnificent collection, which was the passion and obsession of Paul Farren. So I'm bicycles through and through, but he was the collector. And it's of a particular period, about 1860 to 1900, which I think is the most interesting when you look at bicycle history, because it's when all of the developments to the bicycle occurred. So the first... Do you want a little bit of bicycle history?
I would love a little bit of bicycle
You're going to be
history.
here an awful long time. The first, what we would call a bicycle, was about 1817. Now, we'd had a wheel, the wheel from 3,500 years BC, but it was only ever used for utility purposes, maybe grinding corn or a potter's wheel. It was used for carriages. But the thing that allowed it to be used for personal transport, where one wheel was put behind another, was steering. And there was a German landscape gardener, Baron von Drey, who got sick of walking around these huge estates. He put one wheel behind another, worked out some steering mechanism, hadn't got round to thinking about pedals. It was a run along the ground, a running machine. So in 1817, you got the beginning of what we now know as a bicycle, and the essence of it was steering. If you've ever ridden a short wheelbase bike and you've caught your toe on that front wheel, you go over. If you left the steering lock on, early bikes had steering locks, you couldn't ride it. You have got to be able to make those micro movements all the time. So 1817, you got this two-wheel thing called a hobby horse, a Draisienne, and it was taken up with a vengeance. It was a real craze throughout Europe and Britain, and all the elite at the time who had been encased in carriages, all these great flobberty old blokes who only ever moved around in carriages, went out onto the streets on this machine. They were ridiculed. The cartoonists of the day made fun of them. So it was a brief craze. It flared and it died. 40 years went by, and then you got something called a velocipede, a bone shaker, and that came about because somebody found one of these old hobby horses, looked at it and thought, if I put something on that front wheel, I could take my feet off the ground. And I could push the front wheel round. So there's an axle, and you know you've got a lot of things that used axles and that mechanism. So here we go. We've suddenly got pedals onto a front wheel, but the wheels were still small. So you're a tall, athletic sort of person, and you'd have said to a maker, "I want to go further and faster." Because when I turn that pedal, all I do is go the circumference of that wheel. Make that wheel bigger, please. Now, this is a very potted history of cycling, but it's the essence of it. So that front wheel was made bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you got things like the penny farthing, because it was these athletic, elite, aristocratic young men who wanted to adopt them. And in Australia, we were early adopters. We were rich in the Victorian era. Gold made us rich. So we imported all these wondrous things. And from that, in the next 40-year period, so you've got Bone Shakers 1860, through to about 1900, all the developments of gearing, rear chain drive occurred until you got to the point where you had a diamond frame, pneumatic tyres, and it would pass for a modern bike, but it might still be 120 years old. So this collection, it's stunning. Paul was... we didn't have kids, we had bikes, I always said, and so it took passion, obsession, and a bit of money to put this together, and it's world class and it's very unusual.
Now, if people want to see the collection, there is a part of it available for the public to see. Would you like to elaborate?
Oh yes, I'll spruik the museum up in Shepparton. It's just being expanded at the moment, so unfortunately you'll all have to wait until after August. But a proportion of the Farren Collection is at the Move Museum in Shepparton, the Museum of Vehicle Evolution, and this is where it started. So you all should go up there. It's a fantastic museum. It has cars, but it also has a costume museum attached to it, and it has, as I say, a very good representation of the Farren Collection up there. So Shepparton, the Move Museum, and that's open 7 days a week. That's where you need to go, because this down here is a private collection, and so you have to battle your way in. Happy to open it for groups, but it's not a public space.
Well, thank you very much for letting us into the hallowed halls today.
Now, I have to say that I'm looking directly at a quote from Iris Murdoch here, and it's telling me, she says, "The bicycle is the most civilised conveyance known to man. Other forms of transport grow daily more nightmarish. Only the bicycle remains pure at heart." And living in the middle of a city, I can only wholeheartedly agree with her that other forms of transport grow more nightmarish daily. So I do think that, the bicycle is such an appropriate vehicle for so many journeys that people currently do by car. So it gives you such flexibility. It's fantastic.
So talking about bicycles and transport, you have told me in the past that you've got a quite diverse fleet of personal vehicles used where appropriate. Now, how do motor vehicles fit into your mix of personal transport versus bicycles? What would the number count and description look like?
Well, I'd say that for me, transport is a tool to achieve journeys, basically, and you have to use the appropriate tool. So public transport, great. Taxis, aeroplanes, trains, buses, trams. Flexibility comes with the motor car sometimes, but not always. Longer distances, door to door, if you've got people who are compromised and can't use public transport. But the bicycle, for me, is my first go-to vehicle, because I live in the middle of a crowded city, and most of my journeys are short journeys, and I find it allows me the flexibility, the enjoyment, and fulfills most of my transport needs around town. So I'm a transport cyclist, but I also love going out on longer rides. I'll cycle across Europe, or I'll cycle down in Tasmania, or beach roads, a favourite in Melbourne, everybody knows that. And it's a buzz, so you can get transport, you can get fitness, you can get enjoyment, and you can improve your quality of life. So my fleet of bicycles fits into my smorgasbord of transport, if you like. I've got a van, which of course is good for carrying bikes. And I've got the usual. I've got a road bike, I've got a mountain bike, I've got a folding travel bike, I've got a 4-seater for having fun on. I've got quite a few bikes.
Well, you know what they say, the number of bicycles required is n+1, where n equals the number of bicycles currently owned.
Yes, well, the plus one's a problem at the moment because I would buy another bike, but they're not out there. You know, COVID has constrained the supply of bikes because everybody realised it was such a good idea. There was less traffic on the roads. They could go out as a family. And so people were buying bikes as fast as they could lay their hands on them, and the bike shops still haven't recovered. There's still a shortage of bikes out there. So there's lots more people at the moment who've discovered the pleasure of riding, and riding with friends and family, which is really quite special, I think.
So you haven't just been content to ride bikes a lot, or no doubt, although you don't say, I'm sure to help Paul quite a lot over the decades in building this world-class collection, but you've also started a lot of bike rides and created a lot of events over the years. You love organising.
Oh yes, events. It's my default position, organising. I mean, it's like ordering everybody around all day. It's fantastic. I've been involved and sometimes instrumental in starting some of the iconic events in Australia. So down here in Victoria, in the sesquicentennial year, we wanted a bicycle event because everything that was being proposed had nothing to do with bicycles. So that was the genesis of the Great Victorian Bike Ride. But prior to that, I had been involved with a touring club in Melbourne, the Melbourne Bicycle Touring Club. And we'd started our own one-day ride called the Mad Ride, Melbourne Autumn Day Tour. It was Michelin originally, but sponsors are fickle, they drop out. So you have to expect that. So the Mad Ride was a one-day ride with entertainment. It was meant to be fun. And I believe that events should be something you can't do by yourself. It's not just organising you to ride 50, 100, 200k, but organising something that you couldn't do yourself. So all the original Great Victorian bike rides had an element that you couldn't have done by yourself. And it might be crossing the Murray River. We got rafts built to cross the Murray River one time because we couldn't get across where we wanted to. Actually came absolutely unstuck because it was a really wet day, and where we landed, the banks were so muddy. We had all these people trying to scramble up the banks, slipping and sliding around all over the place. We went up to Rutherglen. We had to extend the platform for the train, which was carrying all the bike riders and their bikes. But we stopped the train so that we could have a Ned Kelly hold up at Glenrowan on the way up there. So all of those early events had an element of entertainment.
That sounds like a Charlie Farren touch. I suspect that was your idea, that hold up.
Lots of things are achieved when there are a group of enthusiasts, and all of those early bike rides, the Great Victorian Bike Ride, the Great Melbourne one-day ride, the Easter bike, spring bike, around the bay in a day, it took the energy and enthusiasm of a group of people. Now, sometimes I can provoke and encourage that enthusiasm, but you have to have more than one person. And the essence of all those rides were the volunteers. The rides worked because we had this incredible number of volunteers, and the rides out there still run with that volunteer component. And I remember one day somebody came and said, because I'd interview these volunteers, and they might be a train driver and have nothing to do with bikes, but they'd have that sort of enthusiasm, and if I could see the light in their eyes, I thought, yeah, okay, we can place you somewhere. But this guy was a rather dour-looking sort of guy, and I thought, oh, what am I going to do with you? And he was an accountant, and he just looked at me and said, I'm yours for the year, you know. And it was that phenomenal commitment of whatever I can contribute, you can have it. And so It was that ingredient that fired those early rides and made them so successful. And it continues to this day, although some of the big rides around the country have failed or closed, and the private sector's stepped in. They don't work with quite so many volunteers, but it's still an essential component.
So before you listed an iconic set of rides, some of which are still going to this day, and as you say, some have come and gone. But of all those rides, which would you say is your proudest achievement?
I think it would have to be the Great Victorian Bike Ride, because we set up systems to move a town. We had 5,000 people, and when we started, that very first year, we started not knowing the logistics that would be required. And we had a very steep learning curve from that first year. Showers and toilets. At the first thing in the morning, if you've camped overnight, the first thing you want to do in the morning is use the toilet. There were no toilets to hire. So we had to build them. We had orthodontists and lawyers building toilets, building washing facilities, building shower blocks, building a kitchen container that we could serve 5,000 meals within an hour from. So it was a logistical operation. But if you came to me and said, "Oh, I'm quite good at running radio stations," and I'd look at you and I'd think, "Okay, we'll have a radio station, but you'll be responsible for it. And I might give you a smidgy little bit of money, but not very much." So we added things to the ride. We added medical, massage. One year we had spas. Because somebody said, "What you need on this ride is spas." So he came along with all these trailers with spa baths on the back. And the same guy the following year, he was a stockbroker, but he'd been on a couple of these rides and was wildly enthusiastic. And he said, "Look, getting your washing done is the big problem." He said, "I reckon I could contribute to that." He said, "I'll get my semi trailer license, and I'll get some industrial washing machines, put them in there, and every day, people can give me their washing and I can have it done and back." So he did this. And the ride was 9 days. After about 4 days of zero sleep, this walking skeleton just said, "I think I've taken on more than I can deal with, bitten off more than I can chew." So that never happened again, because it was just such a 5,000 people want their washing done overnight. That's a tall order. But if you thought that it would contribute to the ride, we would enable it. As I say, radio station, newspaper, massage, whatever it was. And we wanted to make it new and different each year to keep ourselves interested. So just the creation of that event and setting up systems that had longevity was so exciting. It was exhausting, it was thrilling, it was wonderful.
So in addition to events, you've also been involved in organisations, and I'll get to Bicycle Victoria in a minute, but I want to start with two ongoing organisations that you've been a director of, which is what was then Cycling Australia, now Oz Cycling, and also the Amy Gillett Foundation, and quite different organisations. So perhaps you'd like to comment both on the differences between those organisations and once again why you chose to put your hand up and be involved.
The Cycling Australian involvement was really, it came about through knowing Stephen Hodge, the Cycling Promotion Fund. Now, Stephen had a competitive background, and I don't. I have a touring advocacy background. And I think it was recognised that the board of Cycling Australia was an all-male, I won't be too rude, a patriarchal group with a focus only on competition. That was their background, that was their skill base, their knowledge, their experience. And so I went in there to perhaps help them see that there was a greater world of cycling beyond just road and track, which was the focus at the time. And I do.
How were you received, Charlie? What did they make of you?
What did they make of me? One of the presidents looked at me as I piped up in a meeting one time, and he said, "It's all right to have one Charlie Farren, but we wouldn't want too many." And I think that was the contribution I was able to make, when they, to allow them to see what was going on around the world, because I would have been going to bike planning conferences in many different countries. I was interacting with a lot of different people. I was involved in advocacy within Australia, and I was involved with a recreational group, that was Bicycle Victoria. And so the non-competitive side of cycling, which at that early stage, Cycling Australia wasn't engaged with. I mean, it's changed dramatically since then. So that was my role at Cycling Australia. I hope I contributed something at the time.
I'm sure you did.
And through that involvement, I became a board member of the Amy Gillette Foundation, and I can remember at the time hearing about that accident. I was in France, in Lourdes, in a hotel. I was over there with, I was taking a group of cyclists during the Tour de France. Don't go to Lourdes, it's the most dreadful place. You might not think so, but I did. Anyway, I was in this hotel in Lourdes. And I heard about that accident, and like everybody else was absolutely devastated. As a child growing up in London, I was never allowed a bicycle because my father's brother had been killed on a bike in London. He had gone under a truck. My parents would not countenance me having a bike or riding to school. And so I think that the Amy Gillette Foundation, the aim of the foundation really resonated. And I don't think I realised that at the time, but I truly believe in what the AGF, the Amy Gillette Foundation, is trying to achieve, which is basically safer cycling. And it's that interaction between motorised transport and the vulnerable road user, the bike rider. That is an issue in Australia. It's not the same in all countries of the world. In Europe, there is a much more forgiving road environment. But in Australia, I believe we have a very aggressive road environment, and we're all contributors to that, whether we are truck drivers, car drivers, bike riders. Even pedestrians can get quite angry if their personal space or their is compromised. It works all the way down the chain, and the Amy Gillette Foundation is working to try and change those fundamental attitudes, and it's an enormous task, which I believe in strongly. We all have to have consideration for the people around us, and on the roads, as they become more and more congested, we've been led to believe that the car will take us from A to B in a given amount of time with no impediment. And that just doesn't happen anymore. The congestion in the city means that A to B could take any amount of time. And so tempers are short, expectations are not being fulfilled. And the one vehicle that can still get from A to B in a given amount of time predictably is the bicycle. So I think sometimes it's bike envy that causes this rage. That you see a vehicle that is still fulfilling that original proposition of predictability, enjoyment, for the most part reliability, and all these other vehicles do not have that.
So on to Bicycle Victoria, which I know wasn't called that when you came on board. And I will preface this by saying, now one of the world's largest advocacy cycling organisations, and for your key role in that, made a life member of that organisation. So I'll just say that up front, just in case you don't. But an organisation that you had an instrumental role in and a long involvement. So perhaps you'd like to touch on a couple of key elements of that.
So here I am, early days in Melbourne, involved with the Melbourne Bicycle Touring Club, having a lovely time going out at the weekends, riding around the countryside, learning about Australia. But knowing that in the city, it was uncomfortable to ride. So I did have that understanding. And we did have, within the Melbourne Bicycle Touring Club, 2 people riding a tandem that were killed by a motorised vehicle. So, that safety factor was there. There was an organisation called the Bicycle Institute of Victoria, and at the time it was very much a one-man band. There was this dynamic guy called Alan Parker, who'd come from Britain, where he had been involved with the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And he also saw that conditions needed to be improved for bike riders. And he was adamant, he was vociferous, he was forceful. But he was not terribly good at drawing other people in to help him. And I think that was the pivotal role that maybe I played in those early days. We knew that to achieve something, it would require more than one person. It would require more than Alan Parker. However hard he worked, however many tables he thumped on, we needed more. And so basically there was a coup. The Melbourne Bicycle Touring Club backed me to stand against Alan as president, and I became president of the Bicycle Institute of Victoria, which morphed into Bicycle Victoria. And I was able to bring more people in, to break that casing around the one person and allow more people to come in. And I think it was pivotal. It was instrumental and set the scene for what happened subsequently, which was the growth of an organisation. And we had a state bicycle committee in Victoria, looking at the 4 E's: enforcement, encouragement, education, and goodness knows what the other one is. And at one point, they looked, and it was Bill Dix predominantly who was in charge of encouragement. They looked at the organisation Bicycle Victoria. We were running a little information service, but we weren't achieving very much in advocacy. We didn't have any money. So they funded a financial plan, a business plan for the organisation, which clearly said, get your finances sorted, make money, invest in advocacy. And that's where the role of the Great Victorian Bike Ride was critical, because that became a cash cow. And it did that because hundreds of volunteers contributed their time. So it was the efforts of the volunteers that allowed the organisation to retain some of the money to put into advocacy. And we grew from strength to strength. We thought the Great Victorian Bike Ride was pretty good, so we thought we'd do one in New South Wales and Tasmania and New Zealand, and I even worked out one round Fiji, but we never did that.
Just something for you still to do.
Yes, so it would work because they got footy ovals, and you could do. Anyway, we won't go into that. It spawned lots of other rides, and so that one was meant to be the entry-level ride, the party ride, thousands of people, timed for school groups to take part after their final exams, entertainment, films at night. It was the party ride. And then we had other rides, so it was a pathway to independence for cycling. We had rides for families, Easter bikes, where you stayed in one place and the little kids could ride half a kilometre and feed the ducks, and the teenage son could ride 200k with an Audax group, and everybody else had a plethora of different rides helped by the Melbourne Bicycle Touring Club. So that was the family ride. We had a one-day ride. So we had this progression of rides that we hoped would launch people on their independent cycling voyage.
Excellent. So, just in conclusion, you've still got a lot of life. There's plenty of zest there. So what's next? What's on the go now? What sort of riding or other activities are still?
Well, personally,
inspiring?
I've discovered that I go half as far in twice the time. I'm not so interested in doing the challenge rides, but I think they still have a place. I've got a couple of rides that never came about, even around the Bay in a Day was always meant to be a closed route. And that's never transpired. People are now shoved off the freeway to go round these silly little back roads, and there are endless different starting points. It's not the iconic concept that we had in the beginning. For me, I still want people to know how enjoyable cycling is, and if you don't ride and you don't ride and you don't ride, why not? It's such an enjoyable way to move around, and it would improve the atmosphere and decrease the pollution if a few more people did that. I quite enjoy still telling people what to do and where to go, so I do run a couple of small rides, but I don't regret leaving the frenetic, stressful 5,000 people for 9 days events behind. I've played my part on that stage. I've exited into the wings, and other people can take that on. So yes, and the other thing that we should have in Melbourne, which is probably not going to happen now, is a huge transport museum. We do not have a transport museum in Australia. We've got amazing collections like this one, car collections, motorcycles, but our history is predicated on transport here. The maritime history. Where is it? It's not shown to people. The government as yet hasn't seen the light and put umpty millions into the creation of a transport museum, but there is a little group of us that think that would be a good idea. And whilst I spoke about the Shepparton Museum, that is motorised and the genesis of motorised transport. It doesn't include some of the other areas of, as I say, maritime or trams or carriages or all the other things that are important.
Well, Charlie,
I've got heaps more to say.
Oh, well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. But really, thank you very much for being an influencer. And thank you very much for your time today.
I haven't been an influencer. I've only done what I wanted to do and enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, there you
On your bike, everybody.
go.